Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the KASB update for Tuesday. We're up to the 27th, aren't we? April is just about over. The legislature will be starting again next Monday. And that means, according to tradition, this is the week that the Senate Ways and Means and House Appropriations Committee come back and start working on the omnibus bill. They've done that. The Senate came back yesterday. We waited to do an update to see whether they would make a decision on K-12 education funding. I guess the news is they did not do that. That means that we still, on the Senate side, do not have kind of a new position. Leah and Scott have been watching the House Appropriations Committee today. They're not to that discussion, but I think there's growing thought that the legislature may simply wait till next week to come back and start serious work on education funding. Let me briefly recap, and you guys jump in when you want. The legislature at the end of the regular session had agreed on, our conference committee had agreed on a bill that would essentially adopt the governor's recommended funding for K-12 education, which includes most of the funding for the last 2 years of the Gannon School Finance Plan approved by the court. I say most of because the plan did not include authorization in 2023 for high density at-risk weighting. But that plan failed on a tie vote in the Senate. Had one more senator supported that, the education funding would be presumably taken care of, but the plan contained other education policy, most notably some expansion of private school aid. So as a result, although most of the state budget passed in terms of agencies in Senate Bill 2007, K-12 education is over half of the state general fund budget. That has not been resolved. And as of today, the Senate Ways and Means Committee finished their work without addressing K-12 funding. We're waiting to see what House Appropriations does, but it increasingly seem like they will wait till next week to come back, perhaps partly to try to still figure out what can be done with COVID funding. Again, I'll give a brief recap and then open up to my colleagues. A lot of the time was spent in Senate yesterday. You guys may have insight today from the House. The state is receiving a lot of funding from the federal government. Education is getting about $1.2 billion. The state of Kansas is getting about $1.6 billion. And then there's just for discretionary purposes, and there are literally hundreds of millions of dollars for social services and healthcare, et cetera. You may remember, audience, that the Senate was interested in supplanting some general funding, general aid to schools and using ESSER funding. That's the money dedicated for schools. It appears less and less likely that is allowable, but it may be possible to use some of these other streams of funding. However, the federal law basically says that states must have a maintenance of effort on both the adequacy or effort, dollars, and share of budget for K-12 and higher education, as well as a maintenance of equity in terms of protecting school districts, high need, high poverty school districts. There's still a lot of direction that is not clear. And so it is very possible the legislature wants to wait a little longer on the allowable use of those funds from a legislative viewpoint. So guys, let me pause for breath and see what maybe you are hearing or adding or think is important to know right now.
Well, Mark, the two House committees, House and Senate, are certainly aware of what each other are doing, and particularly once the Senate Ways and Means let it be known today that they weren't going to have their K-12 discussion until next week, that really kind of made those of us watching the House appropriations kind of wonder if they might take the same tack. And as the legislative research staff was going through their rather long memo about the federal funds, the federal COVID funds, the committee chairman had them go very quickly, didn't really allow folks to ask questions about specifically about the $830 million that goes to K-12. He didn't really entertain any questions. And then, there was some discussion in some other parts of that memo about some of the guidance regarding some of this federal COVID funding for some cities might not be available from the federal government until about May 11th, which is really about the time that the legislature would like to be kind of on its way home. So if the legislative research staff is still not quite sure how some of these funds can be spent, it's difficult to think that the House Appropriations Committee will do much tonight to sort of try to make some assumptions or make some decisions on that. The chairman did say he does intend to finish, he said late this afternoon or early this evening. So makes it seem like we'll probably not see much action, at least on K-12, until next week.
Scott,
Yeah,
anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm just kind of conjecture that maybe one of the reasons we're not seeing much action on K-12, although we would have liked to have gotten a hint as to how they were going to approach it, but we're not seeing much action is because, for one thing, the governor and the legislature, she vetoed a lot of bills and a lot of provisions in the budget appropriations bill 2007. And so I think they're going to come back and do a lot of veto overrides. There's conflict between the governor and the legislature about the oversight of the COVID funds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's going to be a lot of these veto override votes, and kind of see where the political landscape is after that happens before they start deciding on they're going to decide on probably on another tax bill. They're going to decide on K through 12 funding. So a lot of stuff is going to happen beginning May 3rd. We were hoping we'd get kind of an inkling as to how they would at least approach K through 12, but apparently that's not going to be the case.
So I think the key thing to keep in mind, kind of a little bit of where we are right now, both the House and Senate seem committed to funding the Gannon money, but the question is, will there be other policies attached that some, including KASB, would find problematic, maybe more importantly, the governor, and can they find some other revenue stream, presumably from the federal dollars, to help pay a portion of that without running afoul of these rules? The legislature got good news last week when about $370 million of additional revenue, the revenue estimates were increased by about that amount. But many legislators are still wanting to do some sort of tax cut bill, which would also play into all of that. That's one of the overrides. And we also are expecting possible attempts to override the veto of the civics financial literacy bill, the override of the firearm safety bill, which specifies what programs the state board is supposed to use for state standards, a possible override of the bill allowing concealed carry permits at age 18, and an override of the transgender sports bill, all of which, none of which passed with veto proof
Right.
numbers, which means that some people who voted no would have to be convinced to vote yes, presumably some Republicans, because the Republicans do have the ability to do that on their own, but haven't yet. So I guess the bottom line is we will keep watching what happens today, if anything. We're expecting to give you an update. We'll play it by ear this week to see what else may happen. But if they wrap up today, we may not have a further report until possibly Friday. We'll let you know how things are looking next week. I think as you continue to talk with legislators before they come back, from our viewpoint, the key messages are fund the Gannon plan as recommended by the governor and basically endorsed by both houses. Preserve ESSER funding for schools to use for COVID recovery. That's the key message there. And I think the final point is on some of the overrides, the governor agreed kind of with a position we oppose, but it really comes down to our message. On other issues, don't override local control or state board authority to add additional mandates at this time. Try to keep those clean. And from our viewpoint, a key thing is also we don't support at this time or ever expanding state funding for private education that doesn't have to serve all students and play by the same rules. So those are the messages we hope you'll continue. We're about out of time. I'm going to wrap it up now. We'll hope to see you Friday. Thanks, guys.